Which direction would you guys like to go? You want to see more about MongoDB, or do you want to talk about maybe why in the world you'd use MongoDB, or why would you use MongoDB? All right, I'm going to be provocative here. This is the part I like. Maybe a little provocative. Maybe I'm not, and maybe I just think I am. So people may wonder, why in the world would you want to use MongoDB? And one of the first reasons that pops out, and this is me changing here, I'm not really talking about Vagrant anymore. So the first thing that pops in my mind is, I want better design. In a world where we store things in a relational database, we're oftentimes stuck making compromises in the applications we develop because we don't want to spend the time mapping between models we use in our applications and how we store our data in a relational database. So the first thing that pops in mind is better design. For example, like on the left side here, we've got this setup of customers and phone numbers and addresses and emails. And the reality is when we work with this information in our application, we probably grab all of it at the same time. Like we're making a statement, for example. We need their name, we probably need their phone number, their address, and their email to send it to them. So we need all that information at the same time, but for whatever reason, it's scattered across 4 different tables. So we have to pull information from 4 different tables. We have to do that like by hand, or we maybe use some type of tool to grab it all at the same time. But it's like this process we have to go about to think about bringing all that information together so that we can just produce something with that one piece of information for a particular customer. So we may grab customer Bob, and we need all the rest of that information. So now we got 4 places to go to get it. On the document database side of things, the best way maybe to think about a document database is that we can store, I like to think of it as like a structure to what we store, but the schema is flexible. So what we actually store can be whatever we want. It's not limited to primitives like numbers and strings. You can actually nest documents. You can have collections of documents. So you have much more powerful way to express how you're storing your data than you do in a relational database. And so what that typically ends up then is if you have something like the model on the left, I don't have a mirror of it, I should have made a mirror on the right of it, but say order and order lines, another thing where 2 separate tables and you might be bringing that together. And you've got the customer as well, so there's probably another table for that, and maybe even another table for products. No, you could actually just have a document that has all that information in it with relationships to other relationships to other document collections, if you will. But in this document, you can put everything you need for a particular use case in it, and you don't have to split things out into separate tables just because you want to have a collection of something as a part of an object in your application. The object-oriented programming techniques we use, aggregate-oriented design, domain-driven design, all those techniques of defining boundaries in your application and having rich models with behavior, those models become a problem to serialize to a relational database. So we have to kind of flip everything around and deal with tables and relationships that really aren't there in our models. So we're then left usually with going, yeah, that's not worth the work for this project because this project isn't important enough. And so then it becomes just a lot of, it becomes sacrificing things that we could have done with that project because of how we have to store things. So it gives you a door to open to explore storing information differently, to give you the capability to model a lot better in your applications. How many of us have to deal with this, where it's like you look at a database and it seems like everything's connected? And you do.
That database looks so simple.
Yeah, right? That's so simple. I tried to find a good image on Google, but it was like everyone that was any more complex than this, I couldn't zoom it enough to make it look like a database. So, that I look at something like this and I go, well, it's at least nice that somebody made foreign keys so I do know what the relationships are, but it also seems like everything's related. And in reality, our applications are usually not like that. Our applications usually have distinct parts. If we look at our applications like this, we have a tendency to really mess things up in our applications because we just start doing whatever we feel like doing and not thinking about how we break our application up to keep it simple. So even within an application, there's probably 4 different partitions of things going on in this system. And if we set ourselves up with a storage mechanism that gives us a rich capability to model partitions of this database and isolate them somehow, we tend to design things a little better in our application because we keep things isolated and don't just allow connections every way from Sunday and have like, I don't remember if link to SQL is familiar to everybody. You load up a link to SQL model for a database and it's got like, you can just dot around the whole database until you blow up the server. Sometimes it's nice to partition things even within our systems. It's just like when we work with an external system, we don't expect to have referential integrity. And so referential integrity is not always important. And when it's not important, it gets in the way. And that's why document databases give us a new model to look at things and kind of force ourselves to think about things a little differently. Especially with MongoDB, where there's some constraints with how you work between documents that don't allow you to do the crazy things sometimes you would do in SQL Server that usually get you into trouble. Or in any relational database, for that matter. Who enjoys create table statements and writing out all the instructions for how to create the storage mechanism to store your data? Yeah, it's not fun. You don't have to do it anymore with the document database. It's implicit off of your code models, for the most part. You could, if you wanted to, have separate models, but for the most part, why would you? So the easy path is nothing. Is there's no extra work. So you would go to trouble to make the models differently, or make them different. And of course, who in the world enjoys modifying a database? Now, I'm not saying that with a document database magic happens. There's still the need for data migrations, but when you change things for the most part, it's usually adding to schemas, especially because of how painful it is to migrate things. Most people don't like to change things. They would rather just add. But now, the majority of those things you're adding, you don't even have to think about. There's no alter table for those things. It's just change your model and code, and it'll now store the new capabilities. Sometimes there's things you're still going to have to think about, like if the old data doesn't have those aspects to it. But you're at least not stuck worrying about an alter table statement. Still stuck with data migrations, though. But I would say about my experience, about 90% of the migrations I would have done in a SQL Server don't happen anymore. They're just automatic with a document database. The reason for that is you've got an object model. You're basically serializing it into a format to store it. In the case of MongoDB, you're basically taking an object model. And who's worked with JSON before? Okay, so you're basically taking your object model and turning it into something a lot like JSON. And you're storing that. And then you're serializing and deserializing from that model. And so it matches a lot better with your applications model. Just like when you're serializing and deserializing to the browser object models. And it's a lot less friction. So if you add a new key or a new property on a model, it just turns into a new key in the document. Yeah?
How does that handle things like permissions or encryption on small entities inside of, like you do in a table? If you wanted to hide customer you were storing credit card information or social security numbers, you wanted to encrypt those.
How do you guys deal with that? Do you do something like that right now, or how do you deal with that right now?
We have separate tables to put those in to go, but we have to do that at the beginning when you create those create statements.
Yeah.
You have to
define that it's like,
here's a schema, these are the steps to do that, here's the key that goes with it.
Sure.
So you can encrypt it.
It happened in your application layer now, probably.
But
So
even like permissions, if you didn't want certain groups to be able to get to that particular piece of data without having those create statements and setting that schema up front.
Yeah, you'd have to look at authorization of who gets into production, basically. But it comes with
code-based.
not necessarily. No, MongoDB does have lots of authorization as well. I'll just say I'm not going to explain all the capabilities because I don't typically run into that. But yeah, there's a means of authorizing access to portions of your database that people are getting in. Typically, though, I'm going to fall back to the beginning and wonder why people are getting into production at all, and wonder why we can't set something up that's scrubbed maybe in a test environment for some of those people that don't need access to everything. As an alternative with some of this automation that might be worthwhile too. So I don't like live in that world where credit card numbers are like stored and maybe somebody needs to have special access to that information or something like that. I'd say keep it separate and authorize separate access because it's very easy. The other great thing is like that test database that I created with the zips. When you add new collections, you don't need to say create new collection to MongoDB basically. It's just going to add it when you save into that collection. So when you save something, whatever collection you refer to, you say get collection and you pass a name, it just creates a collection if it doesn't exist. So it's very easy to like create new databases and new collections with MongoDB. And if the author, however you want to granularize your authorization, you could have a separate database with some of that in it, lock all the access out of that database. It's really easy to work with multiple databases without a lot of hassle. Yeah.
When I think security at all of the layers. So
absolutely.
That's one of the things that made me question.
We have to do it at sometimes in the field of column level with the table or whatever.
Yeah. I think in my mind the stuff I've dealt with we would have been encrypting it in the application before it ever flew across any network connection, and then we decrypt it on the application level as well. So. And then nobody sees it because it's just encrypted data sitting in the database. So
yeah, that's
so Mongo can run on SSL too. So that's one benefit.
what's that?
That Mongo can run on SSL too.
Oh yeah. The connection can be there's all kinds of things you can tweak with as far as the connection. You can tunnel over SSH. So if you wanted to, yeah.
Thanks.
Sometimes I say maybe if none of those reasons stand out to you, if nothing else, the thing I really appreciated was it broadens your perspective of how you store things. I don't know. I mean, I grew up in an age where like SQL is the only way you stored anything. No files, no nothing. Like I guess there's configuration files, but you don't really look at it as like a database to store stuff in a file anymore. Maybe you have CSVs you import, but it's only to get it imported into a database. So like I grew up in this world where relational databases stored everything. And I know that hasn't always been that way, but I think that there's a tendency with the dominance of relational databases and what we do to like skew our perspective of how we store things. And if anything, learning and playing with MongoDB or a NoSQL type database gives you the ability to broaden your perspective of how you use SQL. For example, when I use relational databases, I will not allow references to float every way from Sunday throughout my database. I don't care that I'm referring to a product that I have a product table for. If there's no need for that reference, there's not going to be a reference there. Because sometimes I want to maintain the referential integrity of things within my code, because it's much more expressive to do that than it is to have stuff cascading throughout my database and worrying about setting up a database to take care of things that I feel like are probably better maintained and dealt with in the actual code of the system. So, because sometimes I feel like there's a lot of great stuff in a relational database, but then sometimes we abuse it because it's there and take it for granted almost, what we're doing with it. Yeah, and we just get ourselves in a place we shouldn't be just because it's so easy to do it. And so sometimes by broadening our perspective of storing things a different way, we run into problems actually, and you will run into problems when you switch your database technology. Like, there's no like pie in the sky system. And it's when you hit those problems that you start to think about, how am I modeling in my application? How am I partitioning things? How am I reading information and how am I changing information in my application? Yeah.
Really look at it for what it is.
Yeah, so when you go back even to a relational model, you start to say, how can I set up this relational database so that it doesn't get out of hand? And so it doesn't have, 800 references.
I don't need all this extra crap in here for it to work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I don't want someone else to come along and wonder what is necessary and what's critical and what's not. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How does it handle large volumes?
Yeah, so that's the other... People talk a lot about scalability, and I love to just talk about these other things first because I come from the world where, like, I'm not Facebook. I'm not, a company that has a bazillion gigabytes of data that I have to store. In my mind, the benefits of NoSQL database come from the design perspective because that's my background. But at the same time, by and large, the MongoDB community is about performance. Probably because MongoDB was really built for performance for a lot of people. And sometimes I feel like the design side of NoSQL databases doesn't get enough attention. It's a two-sided thing. There's two things going on there. So sometimes you switch to document databases because they force you into a world where you can't just do everything you want. And so you have to think about not only how you're going to use things you're storing and how you're going to interact with them, but how it can be performant as well. And then you're forcing yourself to partition your data in a way in advance of how you actually use it. So you have to think about how you use it instead of after the fact going, well, let's just do this too, and let's just do this too, and let's just do this too, and not think about it at all up front. So
we're taking our stuff in a NoSQL database and exploding it with referential integrity and plugging it down into a SQL Server database.
Are you doing that?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're trying to redo stuff, and it increases the volume and blah blah blah. So
Yeah, with all those.
It's smarter.
Yeah, with 100% like acidity going in every direction, you can. It's easy to not think about things because you can usually do it somehow afterwards, but it doesn't mean it's going to like work or be performant, and you're not going to have all kinds of problems. Yeah, and really overload a database at that point, though. You can take the modeling techniques of a document database and bring them right back. For example, I like to think of a document database as almost like in SQL Server, if I could put a row inside the value of a field. So if I rows in a table, my wonderful artwork here. If I could put another row in here, all of these could have their own rows. This might be, for example, customers, and this might be my address. Or I might want to put in rows in a field value. So this is customer Bob, this is Jane, and Jane only has one address, but Bob has two. And maybe the email is just, maybe there's like two parts to something about the email that you want to store. So instead of blowing it into tables, can you put rows inside of field values or a whole table inside of a field value? You basically have what you can do a lot of times with a document database. So
that's what our NoSQL does.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So then we kill it over there.
Yeah. The really nice thing is when you're updating this, though, the crazy thing about partitioning tables, like I've shown before, is that when you go to update what's only really like one row or one document in the document database side of the world, you can have all kinds of deadlocks going on because other people are updating completely disjoint documents, basically. Disjoint data is updating at the same time, but reference, or like all the constraints of consistency and whatnot.
For the rights and reads,
Yeah, for reading and writing purposes, has to be maintained, and so like you run into deadlocks for things that never, it would never happen. Would never happen because the data is never accessed that way.
I was curious if you had any experience with graph databases and how those compare.
I haven't used them at all, but again, it's just breaking out of that model, broadening the perspective there too. So sometimes I think that there's a set of problems that a graph database can better handle if it's relationships between things, for example. I remember in the past trying to store stuff like that in relationships between objects. And a SQL database is just like, That's that thing though, when you grow up under like this guise of everything gets stored in a SQL database, you start to use it, see it as a hammer that can, anything's a nail, You can beat it over the head with it, and you can make it work. It's not a good idea though. Yeah, so I guess a graph database, there you're going to be, is a problem like graph-like with relationships and stuff. Or object database is slightly different. I already hit on these actually. I would just like to go back and talk about design, but when you get to the NoSQL side of things, like, it's frustrating because it's not exactly the same as when you're modeling in a relational world, and that's a good thing. But then you're like, well, how do I model? And so just some tips, like off the top of my head at this point, because we're running out of time, but is to think about how do I read my data and how do I modify my data? And if you look at that, you can start to see where you may have document boundaries. And then the other thing would be look in your SQL relational databases and look for constraints, like cascading deletes, for example. Or maintaining referential integrity. Look for those constraints, and that's where you'll find the different tables that probably become part of the same document. For example, you have a customer, and they have a set of addresses. Deleting an address or removing an address from a customer is like taking a sub-object off of that object model. So you got like a list of addresses in memory, you've got address objects, and you just take one out of a list, save it. It's like basically the cascade delete for you. Think about how you use information in your system. How can you partition your system? And then you're just like the document modeling will kind of come naturally at that point. Working with MongoDB and .NET is really, really, really pretty simple. I've abstracted a few things because this is a part of a bigger example, but all you're doing to connect is a connection string, and you new up an instance of a client that goes out and gets an abstraction of the server. It's like a representation of your Mongo server, gets a representation of the database. You're like drilling down this representation of the Mongo server until you get a collection which stores documents. And so a lot of cases you're getting this representations of, it's like a SMO in SQL Server, and then you're going get collection, and you've got a Mongo collection. It's like a list of rows. It's like a table with records in it. And there's two different primary ways you work with it in .NET. There's a very generic abstract representation called BsonDocument, and it's more like the Bson representation of documents that Mongo uses. When you're using that model, it's typically for performance reasons, because you don't want a lot of overhead. Though, for the majority of time, you'll want to use good design techniques, and I recommend that, and have nice object-oriented models. And in that case, you specify a model, like I have a zip code model I made, and it will serialize to and from this model. So you can start to add things like, there's location for a zip code. And when I'm in the view for that using a generic model, I have to like index the array and assume there's an object there. But you don't tell me location, which one's latitude, which one's longitude? I don't know. I don't expect myself to remember that. If, however, I've got this, it's pretty obvious. I can't make a mistake. Well, and if I do make a mistake, I can go fix it really easily, and then everybody else will know which one's which, right? And it'll be like a commit in the code. Maybe somebody forgot to put the latitude and longitude on there, and I just get an exception in the other view. Now I could go into that code that gets a latitude and longitude and do something different if it's not there, depending on how I want that to behave in my application. So you get back the ability to easily map to models, like zip code, that you can start to add rich behavior to. And it really helps improve your design. And I can do things in the constructor now, like I can make sure that array is always there. I can have class invariance now again with my data, basically, and know that things are always a certain state when an object is sitting there. And be able to work with it and not have to worry about problems that I might have to try and deal with if I'm using a generic model. I've got another example of how easy it is to save data. Because you can imagine, if you're going to serialize to JSON, it's not very hard to save it. You pass your object to the MongoDB driver, and it serializes it and stores it. That's all there's involved. So saving is actually really easy. This is an application with rentals in it, and here I'm adding a new rental. And I am using some, I use a post rental command and then I create a new rental object. The rental object has got some behavior to it, but then this just gets serialized by calling insert. So I'm going to add a new rental. All I do is insert. There's no link to SQL mapping. There's no ORM configuration mappings or anything like that. It just works. It just takes an object, serializes it, and it moves on with the day. Now, if you want to change that and you want to tweak the models to be different, you can do that. And there are reasons to do that. Performance or how you want to store things, for whatever reason, you can do that, but you don't have to out of the box, and I recommend not, actually. Just keep it simple. That's inserting. Finding an object, pass the ID, and you'll get the object back to you. So it's really easy to work with that. All of this is working with a collection, just documents in and out, documents in and out. I love showing this because a lot of...
Can you use this to get information from my other NoSQL database? This seems easier than what I did. Sorry.
What's that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, which NoSQL database are you using?
Reality.
Oh yeah, I mean this driver won't work with like just anything, but this will work with MongoDB. But that is actually one of those things I like to talk about why you wouldn't want to. And actually one of the problems with NoSQL databases is you got to think about longevity and like the fact that you have to learn a new mechanism to query and interact with your data.
That'd be better to learn that.
Yeah, you know what, and I can't recommend one thing or the other, but I can say MongoDB is very popular, and it gives you a lot of the dynamic capabilities you'd expect in a relational database to keep you from being very frustrated, but also it keeps you from doing some crazy stuff.
Because it's simple.
Yeah, because there's some simplicity to it. You can't like join data between collections, so you've lost what I refer to as inter-joins, but a document itself has the intra. The joins within a relation, within a model, you still have. But the joins between models aren't there, a lot like is recommended in aggregate-oriented or domain-driven design to partition things and keep references under control. So you do kind of put yourself in a pit where you've got to make sure you think a little bit about how you're working with stuff before you just start saving stuff. But out of that thought process comes a lot of benefit down the road. And then beyond that, I like Mongo because you can do basically dynamic indexing of your data to search for stuff. You don't have to define all the indexes up front for how you want to get access to your data. Though you want to, just for performance reasons, just like a relational database, but you can do some dynamic querying to kind of spelunk your data as you need to. But there is an investment in a learning curve with these technologies.
Those support transactions, like if you're debiting one account and
yeah, so
debiting
the level of like consistency or like within which atomicity, I should say, actually, is on a document, not beyond that. So everything within a document, because like in an object model, you basically like have transactional consistency within that object model. What's that?
So
Bob's a document. So if you want to update Bob and Jane at the same time, there's no consistency between that, or sorry, no atomicity between that. So.
But there are like NuGet packages like MongoDB that help you with
yeah, you can do some. Yeah, you can.
Some really neat packages that they already kind of have it out of.
Yeah. That's another one of those things. By giving that up, there's performance benefits. At the same time, sometimes you need that, and so it's either a matter of finding a mechanism to do it yourself, or finding someone else who's done it, or some of those cases that just use a relational database when you're doing bank account transactions and mix and match too, because there's nothing stopping you from putting them both together. So
some of them just be a matter of looking at the data a little bit different. So like you take the bank account.
Yep.
You're doing, let's say you're doing a bank transaction. You have your source account, your destination account. Maybe you have a transaction column there, and you put I debited from this account, transferred to this account. So you already stuff in one document.
It would be fine for the history, but for knowing the current values, it wouldn't work so well. So.
Yeah, you'd always have to think about that. Yeah. I've used these for a while, and I would say that that's never really been a problem as far as atomicity, like trying to do a transaction across documents. So
it's
a lot of times I
depend on your domain.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of times where I used transactions in the past is try to maintain like updating things across different tables in a relational database across like lots of saves. But for things that were like all would be happening in a document if I had modeled it within a document-oriented database. So I was just using that mechanism to keep everything in sync that would have normally just been in sync because I would have modeled it differently in a document database.
Sometimes you do a bunch of updates and changing different things, and then you might update 10 tables at once, or
Yeah.
that's on the
Yeah, exactly. Then the fun thing there is even though I'm like updating Bob and someone else is updating Jane, we get deadlocks between transactions because we have to like maintain all the things about those that are stored everywhere, and we want it to all commit at the same time, basically. and just to update Bob, but then Jane is already updating and the timeout goes and now your application's deadlocking and it's...
So you roll back.
Yeah, yeah. And then you got stuff you just gotta fix
And
for
you
no...
need to retry policy.
Yeah, oh yeah, you get like, and for no reason other than like you could have just like modeled it a little differently and the problem would go away, so...
I see there's places where I can use this, or I'm using SQL Server, that
Yeah.
really might be more applicable, better use.
Yeah, and mix and match. Like a lot of people will use like a document database for changing objects, and then use a reporting database in SQL Server so that the BA who knows SQL can get in and explore the database, you know, or whoever it is, and
Yeah,
you
I
know.
used to work at PayPal, and they mix a lot of stuff all the time, a lot of different apps in the applications. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
And why not? You know, take it. That's with that broadening perspective. You're like, you know what? Oh God, it would be so nice to have a document database here, but oh God, I wouldn't even want to try and deal with bank accounts in a document database. So, I split it up. So, and take advantage of the best of both. I find it like it's really a great MongoDB is a great tool when you like hobby projects on the weekend too, because you're not writing create table statements for like 2 hours of your time.
Right.
You just get to spend all your time working, right? Or playing, I should say, and not like doing ceremonial things.
And I'm not taking forever to do virtual box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I can just like for example, and I know this is true though. Like I want to play with the desired state configuration in PowerShell. Do I want to spend time getting an ISO for Windows and installing everything I need and making sure it's the right version? And
Especially it's damn dull. So.
yeah, yeah, none of that's fun. But playing around with desired state configuration is a cool idea. So that's what I want to be doing, not all the rest of that. So it'd be nice when you have those tools. Or like I'm doing courses where I'm teaching people how to do things. Guess what? If I've already done it to my machine, I'm not going to probably remember all the steps, even if I try and uninstall it and put it back. So I just spin up a VM, go through the process myself, and then I have instructions for somebody else. And then I delete the VM when I'm done. And even better, I just automate the process with the VM and just hand them a script to work with. So I can recreate what I've done.
And it's actually what you've done.
And I know it's going to work for somebody else and not just work for me because, you know, I just jiggled my machine around the right way to try and get most of the instructions correct.
We do a
So
lot of code reviews and exchange to make things work, and so you have to try and explain to the other guy in this machine, you know.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've got to get all this stuff set up so you can review the system.
So I'm pretty fairly new in Mongo, and I pretty much love it. You know, it's like what some of the concurrency problems that I have to deal with. Like I have that Mongo Kennedy, you know, stuff like that. Another thing, you know, you can use potentially your data set, change the state. You can use like SignalR, you know, so you have that. But you know, my question is, you know, when it's pretty fairly new, I mean, the driver and stuff like that. Put an application together with AngularJS, you know, real quick. So my thing is like, how do you? This kind of like it's kind of dumb, but how do you do backups? How do you? What's in MongoDB for it?
You can do Mongo dump, Mongo export. You can do file system snapshots in some cases.
Okay.
But yeah, there's tools. As a matter of fact, they're really easy to work. You saw Mongo import before?
So it takes Mongo collections then, like so all the collections.
Yeah, you could just basically back. Yep.
Into one file.
Yeah, you can use Mongo export for things like CSVs, I believe, and JSON if you want that representation, or you can use Mongo dump and Mongo restore if you want. I believe it's just storing it like BSON like representation or something like that. I'm not an expert at that though, but I know that when I've used them, are really easy to use. So easy that I automate and forget how to use them.
I guess one thing worth mentioning is that just there is a limitation on the side of the document, right? To which
Yeah.
you're gonna start using GridFS.
Yeah, one of the other reasons, like I recommend using Mongo actually is because GridFS is awesome for storing files. But yeah, once documents get too big, you would move them over. They're more like files almost at that point, and you can store them in GridFS any size document theoretically. It's basically breaking a document into lots of little documents that represent the content. But I use it for actually storing files in the application because it's so easy to just store unlimited number of files theoretically, and index them on a nice document to represent the metadata of the file, and however you would like. And that's a document too, so the metadata you track can be whatever you want.
So I know a Mongo server running on Windows. You mentioned something in the beginning saying that the best performance out of a Linux box.
Yeah, I mean, there's like you go to production. Why would you pay for Windows when it works great on Linux? Like, and to be honest, why would you use Windows when it's easier to automate anything on Linux? So, especially in the server world. I mean, you can see how to install like MongoDB's like apt-get install MongoDB basically, unless you want a different repository for it. Windows is really easy, I know, because you can just download a zip file and run the program inside of it, but then you have to register it as a service and all that jazz. And a lot of that is a manual type process or running in MSI or something like that. So then you have to find a way to automate running in MSI. And yes, you can do that with Chocolatey, for example, but it's extra steps. Just because that in the Windows world we don't have this idea yet that software should be installed automatically. It's a push button click thing. It drives me nuts. So, but that's changing. Like Chocolatey, you really want that automation. You should look at Chocolatey if you haven't looked at it. A lot of great stuff you can do with that. So, yeah. Yeah, so a lot of times I'll put Chocolatey on a Windows VM that I create because then I've got it there and I can install packages. It's like most of what Chocolatey does is wrap around MSIs that you could just download and run yourself and just does quiet installations of them. And it's at this point it's mostly people contributing what they want to contribute. It's not like Microsoft's backing it, but it seems like I hope at some point Microsoft will get behind this and help start supporting something like this to be part of Windows because it just makes sense. So, matter of fact, when Windows Store came out in 8, I was like, oh my god. Somebody finally realized what they need, you know, the light finally came on in someone's head, and then I'm like, oh yeah, you can't install anything. This is not a platform for distributing like regular native Windows apps. Because the reality is like, you want a tool, you've got to just search the damn internet. And you can't trust that, and you can't always find what's out there, and you don't have a discovery mechanism. So it'd be nice to have a discovery mechanism for software. Imagine that in 2000 and whatever, 14. Here's your discovery mechanism. I go here all the time when I want to do something and I know someone probably knows the best tool to use. I can go here and look at downloads and start to get an idea of what other people like and start to base my decisions based on probably intelligence of other people, crowdsource some of your finding tools. So, yeah, like PowerShell, for example. Like if you want to install PowerShell on a server, there's 3 right there and PowerShell 4 right here. So if your SKU can support PowerShell 4, it's as easy as a command to install it. And Box Starter is another project that like wraps these up in recipes, almost, if you will. Like I talked about partitioning into virtual environments, your project that you're working with. You still have all these tools on your development machine you love. You could start using this to do that part as well. So what's stopping you from using automation to set up your development machine? For example, I hate editing the host file when I want to have extra little aliases for things. So I use Puppet to do that. I just have a Puppet desired state of configuration for the IPs and aliases I would like to be using. And if I need a new one, I don't have to go run as an administrator my Notepad program and edit a host file and like just get put off by it and say, screw it. Now I just go open that up. I change my list. I sync it with Dropbox, so I have it on all my machines. So I can just run Puppet apply on whatever machine I'm on, and my hosts will be updated. That's it. That's all I got, unless someone wants me to explore another direction. So,
Great.
Yeah. Hey. Glad you guys liked it. So.